My name is Joe Molinaro, and I'm with the National Association of Realtors, and we're very happy to be a sponsor of this conference. We have had the pleasure of working with the Center for Planning Excellence over the last few years. At the Realtors, we have a smart growth program, which I manage, and we've been working through the Louisiana Realtors Association and many local realtor boards in the state to work with CPEX on their Louisiana Land Use Toolkit project and help sponsor a series of 10 local workshops in 2009 where we met with local leaders and planners and explained to them the resources available through CPEX's Land Use Toolkit. So it's a real pleasure to be here with you for this conference. I get to moderate this session, which is called Where the Sidewalk Ends, Mobility and the Market. And we'll look at the increased demand for walkable urbanism and the increased property values from walkable urbanism. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Christopher Lineberger. Chris Lineberger is a land use strategist, a teacher, a researcher, an author, and a developer. And he is someone who balances business realities with concerns of the environment and our communities. He is a professor and founding director of the Graduate Real Estate Program at the University of Michigan and is also a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Chris is founding partner of Arcadia Land Company, a development and consulting firm focusing on new urbanism and transit-oriented development. He is also president of a group called Locus, Responsible Real Estate Developers and Investors. This is an advocacy group that is working on transportation and climate bills in Congress. Chris's most recent book is called The Option of Urbanism, and I have my copy with me. This is a fabulous book that, in a very brief format, lays out a discussion of how we came to this point where most development is suburban sprawl development and the increased demand for doing it a different way. And it's a really great read and gives you a good summary of a lot of the issues we'll talk about over these next 2 days. Chris is also the author of a book called Strategic Planning for Real Estate Companies. He has written for numerous publications such as the Atlantic Monthly and Urban Land Magazine and has been profiled by CNN, National Public Radio, The Washington Post, and other media. Chris was voted one of the top 100 urban thinkers of all time in a poll conducted by the International Urban Planning website Planetizen. He is a graduate of Swarthmore College and the Harvard Business School. Please join me in welcoming Chris Lineberger.
Thanks, Joe, and great to be back here. I'm down here over the last 30 years many, many times. One of my backgrounds and what we're talking about today is why does the market want this stuff? And prior to getting into real estate development, prior to getting back into academia, I, for 20 years, ran and owned a company called RCLCO. RCLCO is the largest real estate consulting firm in the country. When I owned it, it was based in Beverly Hills out in California. It's now based in D.C., offices scattered throughout the country. In Joe's organization, the National Association of Realtors, has outside their On Common Ground publication, and it talks about the market for what we're talking about here, smart growth, walkable urbanism, whatever you want to call it, new urbanism. And much of it's quoting RCLCO, because this is what developers are now hearing from their consultants. This is where the market's going. And if you all don't catch up with it, you're going to be out of luck as far as being competitive and being relevant from an economic development point of view and to create the kind of economic growth. Because what we're dealing with here is a structural change in how we build the built environment. This isn't just some cyclical thing that comes along every 6, 7 years. I think most of us understand we have been through hell over the last 2 years. You, of course, have been through more than that. And that this structural change in how we build the built environment is being driven by a changing demand for walkable urban places. And you heard this from Beth just a few minutes ago. You heard it from Tom and from Ilana. So this talk is going to be about the market for this stuff. Why does this exist? Later on this afternoon, I'm going to talk about what do you do about it, and also what happens if you don't do anything about it. And it was an article I wrote for the Atlantic 2 years ago entitled The Next Slum, which talks about the places that don't get this and where they're heading. So first, what are we talking about? The built environment. Built environment is your homes, all the real estate that exists, the office buildings that are outside here, but it's also the infrastructure that supports it. When you look at the built environment, infrastructure and real estate, it's 35% of the entire asset base of the country. If you wanted to buy the country, if you happen to have an extra, $210 trillion, you could buy the entire United States of America, of which about 70 trillion is what you'd be paying for all of our homes, all of the rental apartments, all the streets, all the built environment. And it's the largest asset class in the entire economy. If you took the capitalized value of all the New York Stock Exchange companies, all the NASDAQ companies, and doubled them, the built environment's larger. This is big. But as we know, in this economy, we're suffering from a very weak recovery. And it's because this asset class is not engaged. The reason this economy is so sluggish is that real estate and infrastructure is on its back, and it must be activated if we want this economy to be sustainable. Second thing to know, and all my friends that are transportation jocks love me when I say this, is that there are 15 infrastructure categories, and first among equals is transportation, because transportation drives development. So if you're at a cocktail party and somebody says, what comes first, the chicken or the egg, you can say the answer is transportation. And so to modify a Winston Churchill quote, we first build our transportation systems and then it molds our metro regions. It is the first mover. It is the rudder on the ship that dictates where other infrastructure goes, and it dictates where we in real estate can build. And by the way, the other background piece of information from an economic point of view to understand is that the built environment is a direct reflection of our economy. It sort of makes sense that the underlying economy of the age really is the thing that gives us this American dream that is the built environment, how it sits on the ground. And of course, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, this country was an agricultural economy. In the first census back in 1800, 92% of us made our living as farmers. Well, naturally, the American dream and how it was portrayed on the land was, it became the first version of the American dream, and it goes back to, it was best captured by that Civil War phrase, 40 acres and a mule. If you just had 40 acres and a mule, you were in high cotton, that you were in hog heaven, that was the way to achieve the American dream. Now fast forward to the industrial economy, which you're in this state in the heart of. The industrial economy was really driven by this machine. 40% of all jobs were related to getting the raw materials that went into this machine, building this machine, insuring this machine, financing this machine, maintaining this machine, providing the fuel that propelled this machine, and building the roads on which it went. 40%. And you're, of course, deeply involved in that energy generation here in Louisiana. So the second version of the American dream reflects that. And it's this drivable suburban way of building, a brand new way of building that the world had never seen. And after the Second World War, this became our American dream. So while you were seeing the USA in your Chevrolet, you were making yourself wealthier. As you were driving home to your Leave It to Beaver home, you were making yourself and the country wealthier. I think we all know that we've moved on. We're in the knowledge economy, the creative class economy. And we're moving, in my estimation, towards the experience economy, where you experience things. Tourism is the obvious example, now the world's largest industry. But you're seeing this begin to sprout throughout the entire economy as we add value by providing unique experiences. And it seems to me that the third version of the American dream, first being 40 acres and a mule, second being that Leave It to Beaver single-family house, third being having options of either one of two ways of building the built environment, because there are only two ways. Drivable suburban, which is certainly a viable option, or walkable urban, where you can walk to meet most of everyday needs. But you see, in this country, back after the Second World War, well, prior to the Second World War, we almost exclusively built walkable urban places. So the pendulum was all the way over to the left. And think of those great places that we built back in the 1900s, 1920s, that are today the most valuable real estate in most communities. Well, after the Second World War, we pushed that pendulum all the way over and just built drivable suburban. And keep in mind, we wanted it. I grew up in Philadelphia, and I remember in a very walkable community, and I remember when my mother drove me out on the Schuylkill Expressway, out to the King of Prussia Mall, first mall in the Philadelphia region, and I thought I had died and gone to heaven. I thought this is great. And I thought someday Philadelphia was going to be a big city, just like, say, Los Angeles. And the market wanted this stuff. So we pushed this pendulum all the way over. And we offered the market the new option, but we only offered that new option, which was drivable suburban, low density, everything's isolated, and you must get around by car. Now, one of the, as I mentioned, you know that I teach at the University of Michigan, and while I come here humbled because the Michigan football team, quite honestly, sucks, and LSU is on the top of the world, I do want to show you just the academic rigor that we at the University of Michigan engage in. My graduate students, the very first thing they have to do is watch popular movies. I know that sounds rough, really tough, but the best one is Back to the Future. The first one is Back to the Future, because this is a movie that shows those two options I was just talking about, walkable urban, drivable suburban, in the same movie. It's the only movie I know that shows you the two worlds. And so you may remember the movie, 1985 is when it came out, and Marty McFly goes back in time 30 years to 1955 to his hometown, and this 1955 town, the downtown is the center of this, what is, most of my students think it's about a 25,000 person town, so it's not a big town. And it's the center of life. It's a walkable urban center of life. You can get there by car, by bus, by bicycle, and in the case of Marty McFly, he gets there by skateboard. It's the center of town life, and it's really quite magical. So let me share you this clip. But even then, in 1955, there was a seed of change being planted. This is a billboard that he drove his DeLorean, or he pushed his DeLorean behind, if you remember the movie. This is a poster or a billboard for the subdivision that Marty McFly ended up growing up in the 1970s and 80s. So fast forward and take a look at what that 1985 downtown, oh, by the way, the name of the town is Hill Valley, and I'll come back and talk about that in just one second. Here, this 1985 downtown, the movie theaters are now X-rated. It's the home for the homeless, and the town square is now a parking lot.
Brett, you look great. Everything looks great. 124. I still got time. Oh my God.
So he goes out to the new center of his community. It's a regional mall, naturally. It's built on the fringe of town. And a couple questions for you. What is this regional mall named after? And I'll give you a hint. Going back to Hill Valley, we in real estate have a nice little trick where we name things, we name projects and subdivisions after what we destroy to build it. So Hill Valley, and this is a made-up town, of course, but but the Hollywood writer obviously was thinking the same way, that he's thinking this made-up town, that they took a hill, pushed it into the valley, and put the town on top of it, just in classical 1985 real estate thinking. So think about what this regional mall was named after. It's obviously big boxes surrounded by asphalt. Just so you know, to get technical on you, it's about 20% buildings, 80% surface parking lot. And what also happened in this scene that's never happened in real life? So you know what it was named after. They bulldozed the poor little lone pine tree to put down the mall. But what happened here that's never happened in real life? Nobody walks down that driveway. Nobody ever walked down that driveway. There's no sidewalk. I mean, you get run over. So these are the two options. And while it's fun to make fun of the drivable suburban, it is a viable option. Most of us grew up in drivable suburban. Most of us live there today. And the market research says there is a market for it. But as I'm going to show you very quickly, we've kind of overbuilt it. And in fact, it's the reason for this financial debacle. But why we've been building drivable suburban is not just because we the people wanted it back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It's also the result of a de facto domestic policy starting in the 50s, and really there's signs of it back in the 30s. It was, in essence, the largest social engineering project in the history of the country. Now, domestic policy, by its very nature, is social engineering. We, in this country, are the most charitable people on the planet. And one of the ways that we are the most charitable is because the federal government allows us to take a tax deduction when we give to charity. That it encourages us. It's social engineering. So it's not some evil conspiracy, it's just the reality of what domestic policy is. But this policy is by far the largest. It started with the fact that, as you heard from Ilana and Tom, that drivable suburban development is generally the only legal form that you can do. 95% of the jurisdictions in this country, it is only legal to build drivable suburban, low-density suburban stuff. As a developer, we've done 9 different projects in my company's history in New Mexico, Kansas City, and back in Philadelphia, and in Florida, down at Seaside. And every single one of those projects has been illegal. I've got to tell you, it gets old doing illegal things constantly. But that's number one. Number two is that we provided massive subsidies for drivable suburban development. If you think that the highways are paid for by the gas taxes, I got a bridge to sell you. The sewer lines, the water line extensions, even the power line extensions, which are generally provided by the private sector, they're all massively subsidized. And the way that it works, by the way, is that this huge fixed cost is allocated on a per unit basis, a per housing unit basis. Everybody pays the same. It would be somewhat akin, how we allocate infrastructure in this country is somewhat akin to the fact that if your state government, in its wisdom, a few blocks down here, that the state legislature passed a law that said that all restaurants must charge the same price for whatever you eat or drink. What the effect of that law is that those folks that don't drink alcohol and are on a diet are subsidizing those that are pigging out and getting drunk. And that's how infrastructure is priced in this country. Now, occasionally, we'll come up over the last 40, 50 years, we'll come up with a few $1 billion to throw at our cities. We have to save our cities. Every single one of those programs have failed. They fail for two reasons. One is the market didn't want it in the 1980s, 1990s. Number two is $1 billion is a token amount of money when you're up against trillions of dollars in grants going to drivable suburban infrastructure. Third reason is that the finance industry has gotten comfortable with financing drivable suburban development. They have models, they have experience, and they have what I refer to as the 19 standard product types. And each one of those product types are drivable suburban that they get. They're all individual types of real estate. And if you wanted to do a mixed-use project with retail on the ground floor, housing up above, and with the retail right up against the sidewalk, and you'd go into your local bank and talk to the banker, you'd blow his circuits. He would not get it, because he or she is used to financing drivable suburban, low-density strip retail. They don't get mixed use. They don't get walkable. The third or the fourth reason is, of course, we in real estate, we cut our teeth on doing drivable suburban stuff. And right now, most of the major home builders are still thinking, good God, once this market returns, we'll just give them the same old that we've always been giving them, just cheaper and faster. And, but hopefully most developers will come to realize that's not what the market wants. So this is how it's laid out on the ground. This is a little model of virtually every metropolitan area in the country. And if you know three things about your metropolitan region, you can pretty much tell how it's grown over the last 50, 60 years. If number one, you know where the, oops, what happened? What did I do? There we go. If you know where the, there we go, where the concentration of executive housing is, tends to be white upper middle income housing. Number two, if you know where the local minority housing concentration is, which tends to be on the other side of town, race has always been a major factor in how we build the built environment. And number three, if you know where the freeways were built, which is a political decision, you will pretty much know that the growth has gone in what I refer to as the favored corridor, the favored 90-degree arc coming out of downtown and going out in one bulbous direction. So in Atlanta, it goes to the north. In Kansas City, it goes to the south. In Denver, it goes to the south. In Washington, it goes to the northwest. In Seattle, it goes to the east. In Phoenix, it goes to the northeast. Every metropolitan area has a favored corridor. Now, it is influenced by topography, and obviously here in Baton Rouge, with that small creek you have right next to you, that does tend to influence where you can go. But every town has a favored corridor. And this growth, of course, is otherwise known as sprawl. Because for every 1% population growth, and you heard it earlier from Beth about Cleveland, which is one of the crazy examples, because they've not grown. But for every 1% population growth in most American cities, you see land use consumption increasing by 8 to 12% as we've geometrically increased the size of our metropolitan areas as we built drivable suburban. But then the market went and changed on us. Back in the mid-90s, we began to sense this. At that point, I still owned RCO Code, doing 400 to 500 market studies per year throughout the country. You began to see, hey, the market was telling us they wanted something different, and the pendulum began to come back. And you best saw it as you saw the turnaround of many of our downtowns throughout the country. This is the beginning of another structural shift as we've shifted to the knowledge-based economy, and there's a lot of reasons for this. But I know who to blame primarily. It's the damn kids. It's their fault. It's the millennials more than anybody else. And as with everything in life, it's best seen on TV. Television is a reflection of who we want to be. Hollywood does more consumer research than any industry in the country. It is not how we're living today, it's how we want to live in the future. So going back in time again, I want to show you a very important episode of I Love Lucy. This is January of 1957, the third week in January. Lucy and her husband lived in Manhattan. And Lucy came up with this harebrained scheme of moving out to the suburbs. And her rationalization was, it's great for the kid, fresh air. And while she didn't put it in this frame, it was this Jeffersonian ideal of that agricultural get back to the dirt sort of thing. And it also was a real pulling out of heartstrings about home.
Oh, Ethel, there's nothing like living in the country. Clean, fresh air, homegrown food.
Lucy, you're not thinking of moving, are you?
Why not? It'd be great for little Ricky. And Grace took us to see the most wonderful house that's for sale. A quaint old early American.
Now, this clip is her looking out over the skyline of New York, having regrets. It's actually the back lot of Universal Studios, of course.
Well, here we are. No more tears, honey?
Oh, no, I'm fine now that we're here. Gee, isn't this exciting? We're in our very own home. The first house we ever had.
Now, that's how the baby boomers grew up, those of you out there with gray hair. And it was obviously Leave It to Beaver, it was Dick Van Dyke, it was the Brady Bunch, all 50s, 60s, and 70s. All of those sitcoms were set in the suburbs. Now, fast forward, and Seinfeld, of course, is the most famous of what our kids were raised on, but also Friends and Sex and the City and a variety of other shows that demonstrated a different view of walkable urban life. The baby boomers viewed walkable urban and cities as nasty, dangerous places that you go and you're going to get mugged, you know, Hill Street Blues and all these nasty places to be. Well, our kids grew up with something different, and certainly Seinfeld was as good a view of this as any. And key issues here single friends strolling safely down a lively urban street. They have delayed getting married into their late 20s, into their 30s, delayed having kids. Some of the biggest.
Hey, have you noticed they moved where they do the interview on Jeopardy now?
Yeah, it used to be right in the middle of Single Jeopardy. Now they do it right after Single Jeopardy.
Yeah, it's much better, isn't it?
Oh, no comparison.
The only show about nothing. But this gave a different view of life to our kids. This is what they wanted. And again, and it was drawn upon, these plot lines came out of a lot of consumer research, a lot of focus groups. This was not some Hollywood hotshot trying to lead us by the nose. And of course then, Sex and the City, again, single women living in a safe, hip, urban, exciting place. And again, of course, delayed marriage and child rearing.
Ladies, this is a miracle. I am in my skinny jeans. I haven't fit into these since 1985, and that is only because I had mono.
So we know who to blame, and it's the kids. But the baby boomers are part of this as well, but we're a secondary part of it. We're obviously becoming empty nesters, soon to start retiring in huge numbers starting in 2 years. But it's really the demographics. All this adds up to demographics. When the baby boomers were growing up, 50% of all households had children living in them. 50% were singles or couples. Today, only 1/3 of all households have children living in them. 2/3 are singles and couples. Singles and couples are, of course, the target market for walkable urbanism. Now, that is not to say families aren't welcome. You just heard Tom talk about this baby boom that we're seeing throughout the country in walkable urban neighborhoods. In his South Side, for instance, where he had to redesign the program. I live in DuPont Circle in D.C., and when I go over to Georgetown in particular, right across the bridge, I'm always being run off the sidewalk by these huge prams, these Cadillac prams of all the young families. But the issue is, what about the future? Over the next 20 years, only 14% of the net growth in households will have children living in the households. 86% will be singles and couples as the baby boom becomes empty nesters and as young people continue to have delayed child rearing and smaller families. The other thing is just boredom. That here in Baton Rouge over the last 50 years, if you moved here, when you moved here, or if you moved here, you would have a choice of moving into a single-family home or a single-family home. Your choice. If you want to go get a quart of milk, you can go to a 1980s strip mall or a 1990s strip mall. Any place you want to go. There was no option. Boredom is a much maligned reason for social change. We like change. But the other thing about drivable suburban that we didn't know when we started this experiment is that as you built more of it, the quality of life declines. That next strip mall next to your subdivision is not welcomed with open arms. It degrades the suburban promise of open space, clean air, and ease of getting around by car. So that's just a reality of how that stuff is built. The other thing, of course, is that the knowledge economy and the creative class that drives the knowledge economy wants it. And if you don't offer it, the creative class is going someplace else. And then finally, there is just, and I'll deal with this later on in the day when I talk in the afternoon about the financing, is the expense of maintaining a fleet of cars to participate in a drivable suburban world. The consumer research that you've heard of that Beth mentioned, here's some more. This is done by a colleague of mine at the University of Michigan, that poor football school to the north here. This was done in both in Atlanta and Boston. One could say are the two bookends of U.S. metropolitan areas. Long story short, very in-depth consumer research. 30 to 40% of us want walkable urban on the left here. 40% of us want drivable suburban, and 30% of us could go either way. That really, when you look at it, stand back from it, you realize that it's your classic American 50-50. We're split 50-50 down the middle. And as Beth mentioned, if more than 3% of the housing stock is in a walkable urban configuration, I'd be surprised. That says that there's huge pent-up demand. 50% who demand or will accept walkable urban, and only 3% supply, tells you there's huge pent-up demand. And what that means is that we're seeing tremendous price premiums. My research at Brookings is showing that there's anywhere from 40 to 200% price premium on a price per square foot basis of walkable urban housing versus drivable suburban. Huge price premiums. By the way, another term for that is gentrification, which is one of the most either loved or hated terms in the country. Now, one of the ways that we measure this is a website called WalkScore, walkscore.com. I'm on the board of WalkScore, and by the way, WalkScore has just come out with Transit Score, just this week. You go to walkscore.com, put in any address in the country, and it'll show you on a scale of 0 to 100 how walkable the place is. If you've got a walk score of 5, 10, or 20, it means you need your car to go virtually everywhere. If you've got a walk score of 5, you have to use your car to go to the bathroom. If you're in the 70, 80, 90, 100 walk score range, you can get to most of your daily needs on foot, which means that it's within a quarter to a half mile of where you live. And what we're seeing throughout the country is that high walk score communities went through this housing crisis far better than high drivable or low walk score communities. And this is Washington, Metro Washington, but this applies to places throughout the country. This is looking at it on a price per square foot basis, starting in 2000. Here is, the green is the average price per square foot in the region in 2000. It spiked in the early part of the decade. DC was one of those places that boomed, and then it bust. It went down about a third. That was the average in the metropolitan area. When you take a look at the luxury, the favored quarter, the white upper middle income housing concentrations, it also spiked. But then it went down just as much as the metropolitan average. In the fringe drivable suburban stuff, it went up not as much, and it crashed and burned by about 50%. This was where the great decline in prices was on the drivable suburban fringe. But look at the walkable urban. It started in price below the luxury suburban housing. It went up through the roof. It did decline, but at much less of a rate. And in the end, it was much more expensive than the drivable suburban luxury product. In essence, the lines crossed in this past decade, where drivable suburban product went down, walkable urban product went up, and the lines cross. That's the structural shift that I'm talking about. And we now have some studies just within the last 18 months from academics looking at the impact of walkability on home value and on commercial real estate. On commercial real estate, a study that just came out this summer, a fellow named Gary Pivo, it was in the Journal of Real Estate Economics. You probably have it in the mail. You'll get it at home soon, I'm sure. This study looked at 4,200 office and retail transactions throughout the country over the last decade. And what it found is that every one walk score point increase led to a 0.9% increase in value. That means that a 100,000 square foot building at a 10 walk score out in the suburbs versus a 100,000 square foot building at a 100 walk score, that same building at a 100 walk score is worth almost 90% more in value. That's significant. The same thing applies to your houses. This was a study done by Joe Courtwright out of Portland, done in 2009. He looked at 95,000 resales, I should say, in 2008, 2009, in 15 different metropolitan areas throughout the country. And every one walk score point was worth between $700 and $3,000 for the same house. And so what we're now seeing, and that, by the way, again, is showing that line crossing, because probably 20 years ago, drivable suburban houses were worth more than walkable urban houses. But those lines have crossed. But building these walkable urban places is a bitch. It is really hard. These things are so complex. Making downtown Baton Rouge happen, making suburban urbanism happen is very hard. It is a completely different skill set. I liken it to that we in real estate became very good at driving NASCARs. NASCARs, you drive straight or you turn left. They don't turn right. They only turn left, which is a strange irony, driving 150 miles an hour. What we in real estate have to learn how to do is fly fighter jets. You go straight, turn right, turn left, go up 5 miles into the sky, or crash and burn at seconds at 600 miles per hour. It's an entirely different skill set, and that's what we have to learn how to do, and that's why you're here today, is to learn how to fly fighter jets. And you must have a strategy for these places. They've got to be managed to succeed. But the thing is that as you add more complexity to a place, it just gets better. Unlike drivable suburban, where more is less, walkable urban places, more is better. That's why this spiral here, this imagery of this upward spiral of value creation. That's why walkable urban places, as you just do more, you add more restaurants, you add more schools, you add more housing, you add more density, the place just gets better. You have more people on the street, values go up, property taxes go up. Now there's a downside to it. And the downside, of course, is affordable housing. And I'll deal with that this afternoon as well. Now, looking at the regionally significant places that are walkable urban, these places where most jobs locate, like a downtown, where civic functions locate, where sports stadiums go, where entertainment goes, I've found that there's 5 types. And it's interesting to note that most of these places are in the suburbs. First, of course, is the traditional downtown. And here are some examples of the downtowns that have turned around over the last 15 years that were dead as doornails 15 years ago, and all have come back. Then some of my favorite places are called downtown adjacent places. So think of downtown as the aircraft carrier, and around the aircraft carrier is a bunch of support ships. That's what downtown adjacent places are. They're within walking distance of downtown, but they're lower density and much more, they have much more character, or a different character. Each of them has lots of different character. Now moving out to the suburbs. We have suburban town centers. These are 18th and 19th century towns laid out on a grid. They have historical buildings. Most of them declined back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but now they've been swept up by sprawl, and many of these have come back. So these are places like Pasadena, California, Palo Alto, California, Redmond, Washington, outside of Seattle, White Plains, New York, Stanford, Connecticut. These are places that are within their metropolitan area, but they have been revitalized because of a great grid of streets, a great urban plan. They were built before the car. But here's the one that's going to be the biggest challenge of the next generation. And when I tell my students, we baby boomers finally figured out how to turn around downtown, it's your job to figure out how to turn around strip retail. Because there are 10,000 dead or dying strip malls and regional malls in this country. And we now are beginning to see some examples of how to turn these things around. Probably the best, well, you have to come up to Washington and you'll see a place, a county called Arlington County on the other side of the Potomac River, which has more examples of strip retail being converted into great walkable urbanism. But the other great model is a project called Belmar, which is the first regional mall in Denver that has been completely transformed into a grid of streets, high-density, walkable urban, very successful. And by the way, there are 12 regional malls in Denver. 8 of the 12 are being converted to walkable urban places. And then the 5th category is what's known as greenfield development, or what we in real estate, for some reason, call lifestyle centers. I don't know who dreamt that one up. But these are places that are, you just add water and poof, you have instant urbanity. Washington, believe it or not, Metro Washington's now the model. You probably get up to Washington once in a while. What you need to do is buy yourself a Metro pass on the Metro rail, because 90% of these places are on Metro rail. And that's what these green lines are. And you can see 20 walkable urban places that are regionally significant. 20 years ago, there were 2. Now there's 20, and there's another 20 emerging. If you want to see the future, come to Washington, take a day, and you'll see around most metro stops billions of dollars of development in high-density, walkable urban places. What Washington shows us, by the way, is that for every 1 million people, there will be somewhere between 4 and 6 regionally significant walkable urban places. Your downtown in Baton Rouge, for instance, is just one of those 4 to 6 per million. But I wanted to show you some examples of walkable urban places in what are referred to in the literature as third-tier metros, those that are between 250 and 750,000 in population. There's 121 of those places in this country. Baton Rouge is part of it. And here are some that have great walkable urban downtowns. Now, again, this is not just happening downtowns, it's also happening in the suburbs, but it happened first in the downtowns. And let me just show you some examples. Here's downtown Greenville, South Carolina. Great, the mayor's been there for 15 years, and he has turned around this town phenomenally into a really dense, walkable urban place, moving the ball field downtown, rediscovering their river, which they had buried under concrete, moving lots of housing downtown. Downtown Boise, Idaho. Here's a town of 500, almost 600,000 people, and you can get anywhere in Boise in 10 minutes in the metropolitan region. And this downtown's emerged as a great place to live and work. My favorite is downtown Chattanooga. I've worked on downtown Chattanooga for 30 years. And here's a town, a Rust Belt town, that by din of civic leadership said, damn it, we're going to have a great downtown. And they've pulled this together. They had turned their backs on the Tennessee River. They now embrace it with their river walk and all their activities facing on the river. The world's largest freshwater aquarium, all sorts of housing downtown. This is a jewel that if you want to see how to do it in the Southeast, I urge you to see downtown Chattanooga. Of course, there's downtown Asheville. Before I moved to Washington, I lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is up in the mountains, an arts place. Well, downtown Asheville is basically Santa Fe in the Southeast, and it has done a remarkable job in bringing itself back. Another example is Center City, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, former industrial town that is becoming the Santa Fe of the Northeast with a major arts orientation. And one of my favorites is downtown Roanoke, Virginia. Who would have thought that this railhead, Roanoke, could turn around its downtown? One of my favorite examples is this new art museum that just built. They it's a Frank Gehry protege that was the architect, and they referred to it as the Flying Nun that crashed in downtown. It's a glorious building, very cutting edge, and in downtown Roanoke. And then downtown Charlottesville. Of course, they have the benefit of having UVA there, but then again, UVA is not in downtown, just as LSU is not in downtown Baton Rouge. So that's the future of this country. Take it and run. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. And we do have a few minutes for questions if anybody wants to ask a question. Let me start with a question, Chris. We know that real estate development is still in really bad shape. So in the short term, in the next few years, are there good prospects for new walkable urbanism projects, or is everything going to be dead in the water for the next few years?
Well, if things are dead in the water over the next few years, we don't have much of an economy, as I mentioned earlier. So we've got to get this thing moving, and I know that the federal administration is doing its damnedest to get the housing market in particular moving. But we've got a huge overhang, and as I'm going to mention this afternoon, this downturn was created, as we all know, by the housing crisis. But what most people don't understand, but as you heard from Beth Osborne, certainly it's getting into the administration, it was caused by the drivable suburban fringe housing. That's what crashed. That walkable urban housing just went flat, declined a little bit, but it was the drivable suburban housing on the fringe that in many metropolitan areas had a price decline of 30, 40, 50, 60% from the peak. That's what crashed. So one could say that this financial crisis was the last gasp of sprawl. But there's a lot that can be, in fact, this is a crucial time to get your act together, get the planning in place. One of the most important things you have to do is to focus on where these walkable urban places are going to be. That this is not going to just be like peanut butter and you spread it evenly all across your towns and cities and throughout your metropolitan areas. We're only talking about probably 10% of the land in your metropolitan regions will become walkable urban. And the question is, where will they be? And it's up to you in this audience to figure that out. Then, once you figure that out, you put in place overlay zoning to allow, and particularly with the regionally significant places, these are not huge tracts of land. Downtown Baton Rouge, even downtown Washington, we're only talking about between 50 and 400 acres in size. So that's why a regional mall, which is about 100 to 150 acres, converts quite nicely into a regionally significant walkable urban place. So figure out where they're going to be, put the zoning in place now to allow the high-density mixed use to take place there, and then simultaneously be working on your transportation systems. Transportation drives development. 100 years ago, every city in this country over 10,000 in population had rail transit. Today, only the largest metropolitan areas have rail transit. We're 3 times wealthier on a per capita basis than our ancestors were 100 years ago. I think we can figure this out. And again, this afternoon, I'm going to be talking about how to finance it, how to make that happen. So there is figuring out where you're growing and get specific down to certain places. Put the zoning in place to make it legal to build walkable urban places. And then be working on transportation to put the infrastructure in, because transportation drives development.
Is there a question?
Yep, very important. What about the education system? And you also touched on crime. We in this country have been blessed by this incredible decline in the rate of crime. And sociologists and police chiefs will tell you 14 different reasons for it. The fact of the matter is we don't really know the reasons for it, but we'll take it. Because without public safety, walkable urbanism will not happen. That's Jane Jacobs 101. But I suspect, now this is the 15th reason, I suspect that the return of walkable urbanism as a market demand factor also is part of the reason for the decline. One of the things we know from a sociological point of view is that when you concentrate poverty, every social indicator goes haywire. It just, that you see a steady increase in the negative social indicators, and then you hit a tipping point of 25, 30% concentrated poverty, and it goes up like this. So hopefully the same thing happens in reverse, and we're beginning to see that as more middle-class people come into our cities where most of the walkable urbanism begins, because the structure of the city is most amenable to it. So that's number one. On the school question, real estate and the built environment, you could put it onto a spectrum of driver uses and follower uses. Those things that can get out front and drive, like housing, and those things that are follower uses, like grocery stores. Grocery stores only come in when there's rooftops to support them. You can't put the grocery store in right up front. It's going to fail. You can't tell the grocer, just wait for 5 years, you're going to have customers. It's going to die. So you got to get the rooftops in first, then the grocery store. Schools are the same way. It's a follower land use. And we're just beginning to see, as we see more mixed income neighborhoods emerge in our cities like Washington, New York, Chicago, that our schools are making some pretty dramatic increases in their quality. Now, I don't want to get too far in front here because, we're just barely seeing this over the last 3 or 4 years. But I believe, I know that schools are followers. Once we get the households in place that are demanding better schools, then the schools will begin to improve. It'll probably be the last thing on that spectrum to come back. So I wish we could lead with schools, but I think it's a follower land use. No, because you can start off with the singles and couples as your initial. Now, but it's critical because many of those couples, they do what birds and bees do, and they have kids. And so you want to keep them. And the big thing in cities right now is we've got those millennials here. We want to keep them, that they're not going to move out when their kids turn 5 and 6. Yes, in the back. Well, that's great news. I mean, and what you're basically saying is that it's possible that you can accelerate it, that it was education. I mean, I'm looking for evidence across the country that we can move that follower land use down the spectrum, over on the spectrum, so that we can use it as a driver, because obviously we want to keep the young people in these walkable urban places. And, you know, we've gone so far in the wrong direction towards privatizing everything. And privatizing public education was a great disaster. I mean, I grew up in the public school system, walked to both elementary, junior high, and high school, and it was this blend of people that you got to know. And if I had just gone to some prep school, I mean, my worldview would have been much more narrow. And so hopefully we've seen a lot of other trends move back towards a more communitarian approach to public services, and hopefully we'll see that with the public schools as well. In the back.
Oh, back there.
Well, bankers and real estate developers, it is hard to teach old dogs new tricks, but the great thing is that the market tends to eventually get what it wants, and if they aren't in the game, they're going to lose. I'm speaking tomorrow to the CEO of one of the top 10 home building companies in the country, who has finally gotten it through his thick head that building McMansions on the fringe is not the future. And that a lot of bankers get it too, eventually. Hugh McCall was one of the great bankers that finally got it. He built Bank of America out of Charlotte, and you know, he's one of the great smart growth proponents in the country. He was flying over Atlanta once in his private jet, in the corporate jet, and over the northern suburbs, which of course is their favorite quarter, and he looked down and he said to his chief investment officer, "Holy smoke, we financed half of that stuff. I can't believe we did that." He gets it. I mean, so bankers are beginning to understand it, but they're just very conservative folk. And I mean, keep in mind that they're financing real estate developers, and for some reason, nobody trusts us real estate developers. I don't know why.
Seeing no other questions, let's thank Chris for a great presentation.